My name is Sandra, and I'm the mother of an 18-year-old college student named Michael. For years, my husband Brian and I have made countless sacrifices to support his education, giving up holidays and tightening our belts in every possible way to secure his future. We live in a cozy, modest home that once belonged to my grandmother before she moved to a nursing home. Brian works at a local hardware store, and I manage the front desk at a doctor's office. Our life is simple, but we're happy with it. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, and I was preparing dinner when Brian's phone rang. His worried "Hello, Mom, slow down, what's wrong?" made me pause. He began pacing, his face pale and tense. When he finally hung up, he sank onto the couch, looking defeated. "It's my parents," he said quietly. "Their business went under. They're bankrupt and lost everything, even their house." My heart sank. "Oh, Brian, that's terrible. What will they do?" He sighed, his worry evident. "They're asking if they can stay with us, just until they figure things out." I hesitated, thinking of our already tight budget and how settled our life was. "And what did you say?" "I told them I'd talk to you first," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is your house too, Sandra. I didn't want to decide without you." Brian's parents, Terry and Catherine, were far from easygoing. They were used to luxury, and I knew our simple home would be quite a shock for them. "You know how they are," I said gently. "This house, it's not exactly their style." "I know," Brian replied, looking torn. "But they're my parents, and they're really in a bind." I thought about it, remembering the times they'd visited and barely concealed their disdain for a modest setup. But knowing they were desperate enough to ask for help softened me. "All right, they can stay, but just temporarily, until they get back on their feet." Brian nodded gratefully and called his mother back. "Mom, Sandra and I talked it over. You can stay with us for a bit, but you'll need to start looking for your own place soon." I couldn't hear a response, but the firmness in Brian's voice. Eyes, Mom, were clear. Said it all. The following week, they arrived. I stood on the porch, my stomach sinking as two massive moving trucks rolled up. Brian managed a forced smile, directing the movers. Terry was the first to greet him, slapping him on the back like he'd hit the jackpot. Catherine swept over to me, her perfume overwhelming as she kissed my cheek. "You're an angel for letting us stay," she said sweetly. I smiled, glancing nervously at the mountains of furniture and boxes now overflowing onto our front lawn. "Is this all just the essentials?" I muttered under my breath, trying to stay polite. "Oh yes," Catherine replied airily. "Just the basics, of course." Brian and I shared a worried glance as the movers began lugging in armchairs, boxes, and even a towering grandfather clock. It quickly became clear that the essentials were far from minimal. Every inch of our modest living room was being overtaken by their belongings, which seemed to multiply as each box was carried in. I pulled Brian aside as the movers took a break. "This is too much," I whispered. "They've brought enough to fill an entire house. Where are we supposed to put all of this?" He rubbed his temples, looking weary. "I know, Sandra. I'll talk to them. Let's just get through today." By the time everything was inside, our cozy home looked like a storage unit. Dinner felt cramped, with boxes stacked around us. Terry and Catherine seemed oblivious to the mess, laughing and chatting as Terry poured a glass of expensive wine. "Sandra, you have to try this," he insisted, swirling the wine like we were at a high-end tasting. Brian cleared his throat, trying to set some boundaries. "We'll need to go over some ground rules," he started gently. "Space is tight and—" "Oh, don't worry about it, son," Terry cut him off, waving a hand dismissively. "We'll make it work, won't we, Catherine?" I forced a smile as they carried on, looking around at the piles of boxes and ornate decorations that had taken over our simple space. This was going to be a long stay. Life with Terry and Catherine was proving more challenging than I had imagined. A few days after they'd settled in, another strain surfaced. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was preparing a simple spaghetti dinner when Catherine strolled into the kitchen, her nose wrinkling in obvious distaste. "What's that smell?" she asked, her tone laced with disapproval. "It's dinner," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "Spaghetti." "Where's the meat?" "The fresh herbs," she scoffed, peering over my shoulder as if the simmering sauce was somehow offensive. Hearing her tone, Brian stepped in, drying his hands on a dish towel. "What's wrong?" "The problem, Brian, is that we're expected to eat this." Catherine gestured toward the pot with disdain. Taking a steadying breath, I explained, "This is what we usually have. We can't afford steaks and gourmet meals every night. Brian's expression hardened, and he turned to his mother, his voice firm. Mom, this is Sandra's home too. If you prefer something else, you're welcome to cook it yourself. Catherine's eyes narrowed as she retorted sharply, Oh, we will. And we expect you to provide the groceries we need. We're not used to living like this. I felt my patience fray. I understand that you're used to different standards, but this is what we can afford. Our budget doesn't cover luxuries. Terry, who had been quiet until now, interjected loudly, Then perhaps you should reconsider your budget. We're not animals to live off scraps. Brian's jaw clenched. Dad, that's enough. We're doing the best we can. Catherine huffed. Fine. Tomorrow, we'll give you a list of what we want to eat. Make sure it's here. The next day, true to her word, Catherine handed me a list filled with items like marbled beef, fresh seafood, and imported organic products. As I looked it over, my heart sank. That evening, we all sat down, the list sprawled out on the kitchen table. Terry declared, We expect proper meals, like steak or fresh fish. Brian and I exchanged a look of disbelief. We can't afford that, he said, his voice firm but weary. It's just not in our budget. Their response was swift and cutting. Lazy, both of you, Catherine snapped. Can't even provide a decent meal. Feeling cornered, I reluctantly gave in. I began purchasing only the finest ingredients for their meals, while Brian and I resorted to cheaper fast food to save costs. A month later, the strain on our finances and patience was beginning to show. After reviewing our expenses, I was stunned to see our food budget had doubled. Catherine's long, luxurious baths had sent the water bills soaring as well. Dinner had turned into a nightly battleground, but tonight felt like the breaking point. As Terry and Catherine enjoyed their plates of marbled steak and imported fish, Brian and I sat opposite them with simple pasta, the only meal we could afford. The difference on our plates was stark, highlighting an ever-deepening divide. Unable to hold back any longer, I finally spoke. This has to stop. We can't keep living like this, eating different meals. From now on, everyone in this house will eat the same food, and it'll be within our budget. Terry laughed dismissively, a grating sound that tested my patience. You expect us to eat that slop? It's not slop, it's dinner. What we eat. I shot back, my voice tinged with frustration. The laughter vanished from Terry's face, replaced by a scowl. Catherine's tone turned sharp. How can you be so greedy and lazy? Cooking a decent meal isn't that hard. Both of them looked at Brian expectantly, as if waiting for him to side with them. That was it for Brian. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the plates rattle. First off, this is Sandra's house as much as mine, and you will treat her with respect, he said, his voice resonant and firm. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. I never thought I'd see the day when you, my son, would shout at me like this. Terry's frustration boiled over as he jabbed his finger toward Brian. Look at you, completely whipped and following her every command. Is this really who you've become? I kept my composure, though my heart was pounding. Enough. This conversation is over. From now on, no more lavish spending on steaks or seafood. We all eat the same simple meals. A frosty silence fell over the room as Terry and Catherine pushed their chairs back and left the table without another word. Brian and I remained, surrounded by the heavy quiet. He reached across the table, squeezing my hand. I'm sorry it came to this, he said softly. I nodded, feeling the weight of the evening settle on us. Me too, but it's the right choice. We can't keep living like this. After that night, the atmosphere at home grew quieter, but the tension simmered beneath the surface. Terry and Catherine's silence carried a hint of defiance, as though they were biding their time. A few days later, as I was cleaning up from a simple lunch of sandwiches, the doorbell rang. Expecting a delivery or perhaps a neighbor, I went to the door, only to be met by a delivery man holding a large, fragrant bag from an upscale local restaurant. Delivery for Sandra, he asked, glancing at his clipboard. I stared, confused. There must be a mistake. I didn't order this. Just then, Catherine appeared beside me with an overly bright smile. Oh, I decided to treat us to a nice meal. We deserve a little comfort after all the tension. I hesitated, holding the bag. Catherine, we discussed this. We're cutting back on expenses. She avoided my gaze, giving a dismissive shrug. Well, I thought a little treat wouldn't hurt. I thought it was on your tab, dear. My mistake, Catherine said lightly. Brian entered from the kitchen, catching the end of our conversation. "What's going on?" he asked. "Your mother thought we deserved an expensive lunch," I replied, the weight of the bag in my hands suddenly feeling heavier. Brian's expression darkened. "Mom," we agreed, "no more of this." From the hallway, Terry's voice boomed. "What harm is a little lunch going to do? You can't expect us to live like hermits forever." I placed the bag on the counter, frustration rising. "It's not just about this lunch. It's every unnecessary expense. We've already said we're sticking to a budget." Catherine's demeanor turned icy. "If you're going to fuss over a simple meal, perhaps we won't bother next time." Brian pinched the bridge of his nose, exasperated. "It's not just about the meal. It's about respecting the household rules. You can't keep undermining us." The argument circled on until at last Terry and Catherine retreated to their room, leaving the untouched, costly lunch on the table. Brian and I exchanged a glance, a silent agreement that this had gone too far. "I'll call the restaurant, explain the situation, and cancel any future orders made without our approval," I said, picking up the phone. Brian nodded, his resolve firm. "I'll talk to them again. This sneaky behavior has to stop." Peace was fleeting. After the unauthorized lunch, Catherine and Terry simmered with barely concealed resentment, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Then, one evening, as I was washing dishes, the calm shattered once more. Brian had just come in from the yard, looking worn, and I was about to ask about his day when a sudden crash from the living room had us both sprinting to investigate. We found Terry looming over a shattered vase, one of the few heirlooms I deeply valued. "What just happened?" Brian asked, his voice measured despite the scene. "It just slipped out of my hand," Terry replied, his tone devoid of apology and edged with defiance. As Brian crouched to gather the broken pieces, I couldn't hold back. "That vase was an heirloom from my grandmother. It has more history with this house than any of us." Catherine, leaning in the doorway, dismissed it with a shrug. "It's just a vase. You can always find another." "That's not the point, Catherine," I shot back, anger rising. "This is about respect, something that's clearly lacking here." Terry raised his voice, his frustration boiling over. "Respect? How about the way you treat us like second-rate residents in our own home?" Brian rose to his feet, facing his father directly. "You're here because we allow it, Dad. Don't forget that." "It doesn't feel like we're allowed anything," Catherine snapped, her tone sharp. "It feels like we're just tolerated." Living with Terry and Catherine was like navigating a minefield. One particular evening pushed me to my limit. We were sitting at the dinner table, the scene of countless past disputes, when Catherine dropped an astonishing new request. "Brian, I saw a lovely coat today, and I think we should use Michael's college fund to buy it," she said, as casually as if she were suggesting a change in coffee brands. I choked on my drink, setting my glass down forcefully. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" With a sweet smile, Catherine mistook my shock for agreement. "It's only money, dear. Michael can take out loans for college, and I do need a new coat." Brian, who had been silently fuming, slammed his fork down. "Mom, that's not happening. That fund is for our son's future, not for your shopping spree." Catherine's expression soured. "How can you deny your mother such a simple thing?" "It's not simple, and we're not discussing this further," Brian said firmly, bringing the matter to an unmistakable close. My last shred of patience finally broke. "Enough," I said firmly, standing up. Terry's voice rose, echoing through the room. "You're being unreasonable and cruel. We're your family." His tone turned cold as he added, "Maybe the local news would like to know how you treat your parents. Imagine what your employers might think." Anger and unease churned within me, but I felt my resolve solidify. "This isn't how a family behaves," I replied. "You both need to find somewhere else to live. This arrangement isn't working." Catherine started crying, casting herself as the victim, while Terry continued with accusations and thinly veiled threats. The argument ended with them storming off, leaving Brian and me in a heavy silence. Later, after the house had quieted down, I retreated to her bedroom and called my grandmother. She picked up after a few rings, her familiar voice a balm for my nerves. "Grandma, it's Sandra," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "What's wrong, my dear?" she asked, instantly concerned. I told her everything. The constant demands, the threats, and how unbearable life with Catherine and Terry had become. She listened patiently, occasionally murmuring softly, until I finished. "I'll come and stay with you for a few months," she decided without hesitation. "Are you sure, Grandma? What about the nursing home?" I asked. I'm sure, she replied. Sounds like you need me right now. Her arrival brought a much-needed breath of fresh air to her tense home. Although age had slowed her, Grandma's spirit was as resilient as ever. Terry and Catherine's discomfort was obvious, their unease practically palpable. I'll be staying on the ground floor, Grandma announced as she entered, her suitcase trailing behind. We might need to rearrange a few things. Terry barely concealed his irritation behind a forced smile. Of course, we'll make sure you're comfortable, right? He said, glancing at Catherine, who nodded stiffly. Grateful for her support, I finally felt like someone was here to set things right. After the movers adjusted the space to accommodate her, Grandma wasted no time in calling a family meeting. I've heard enough from Sandra about these issues, and I'm not pleased, she began, her tone sharp and direct. Terry started to object, but Grandma silenced him with a raised hand. I'm not finished. Technically, this house is still under my name. I allowed Sandra and Brian to stay here rent-free, but that doesn't extend to you too. Catherine's face went pale. You want us to pay rent? She stammered. Yes, I do. $5,500 a month, Grandma replied evenly. That's outrageous, Terry protested, rising to his feet. Grandma's gaze didn't waver. Considering the expenses you've run up, you could manage it by cutting a few luxuries. Her voice softened slightly, but her words held firm authority. If rent is too steep, you're welcome to find another place to live. Or if you stay, you'll help me daily, moving around, preparing meals, and making sure I take my medications. Catherine's defiant demeanor crumbled. She looked stunned, while Terry seemed caught off guard. Think it over, Grandma concluded, her tone leaving no room for argument. I expect your decision by tomorrow morning. The next day, I walked into the kitchen to find Terry and Catherine packing, boxes piled by the door. Terry glanced up briefly, saying, We've decided to move out. We found a small apartment. It's for the best, Catherine murmured, barely looking at me. The rest of the morning passed in a blur as they packed and moved out. Brian helped out of obligation more than anything else, and soon, our home was finally peaceful again. By mid-afternoon, the rooms they had occupied were silent, the echoes of their departure leaving a lingering sense of relief. Grandma, watching quietly, gave me a knowing smile. Well, that's that, she said with finality. They'll be fine. Sometimes a little hardship is necessary to bring people back down to earth. We later heard that they'd sold most of their possessions to cover their new expenses. Their once lavish lifestyle had been reduced to the basics in a modest apartment. Grandma stayed for another 3 weeks, her presence a comforting anchor. When it was time for her to return to the nursing home, I felt both sadness and gratitude. Thank you for everything, Grandma. I don't know what we would have done without you. She waved me off with a smile. Oh, nonsense. You're stronger than you think. Just remember to stand up for yourselves. No one else will do it for you. Her words filled me with confidence. As I drove back home, the house felt more spacious and calm than it had in ages. That evening, Brian and I sat together on the porch, letting the gentle evening breeze soothe us. Life had thrown its challenges our way, but we've faced them as a team and come out stronger. And we were ready, whatever the future held.